everybody. Devin from North Adams Yoga, back today to talk about adjustments for your downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. In this position, I want you to think about two different ways that you may modify or adjust the position. One will be based on sensation, what you may feel that may not be comfortable, sustainable, or just making the position more enjoyable. The other way to think about the posture is the alignment and the focus of the different muscle groups, the bone structure, and how they align together. So for those positions, you may actually want to use a mirror, film yourself, or take a picture of yourself if you're not quite sure the shape your body is making. For props today, it's whatever you've got, whatever you like for these adjustments and modifications. Just going over some of the options that you may also just use in a regular class when you're back in the studio as well. So for props, we have 2 blocks you may or may not use, a blanket you may or may not use, and then we also have in the studio these purple foam wedges. They sell these online, Amazon, yogaaccessories.com, you name it, you'll be able to find them. They're just a foam wedge that creates an angle for your wrists, and I'll go over those details, but we do have a couple in the studio if you're using them in the studio. So for today, a couple of modifications based on sensations to start. Sensations in downward facing dog. If we think of the shape of downward facing dog, is a deep hip flexion, creating a triangle with our body. So the hands are on the ground, shoulder distance. The toes curl under as you lift the hips up and back, making this peak or this angle in the hips or a mountain shape through our body. This requires a pretty deep level of flexion in the hip flexor, which can be limited for a few different reasons. Most common reasons are tension or shortness of the hamstrings, the back of the legs, calf muscles, or limited mobility in the shoulder. So a couple of modifications based on sensation you may be feeling. If you get into the pose, into downward facing dog, your hands are on the ground, your hips are up and back, and you're looking at your feet, and it feels really rounded or compressed in your low back. Maybe you're finding your knees are bent, and it feels really tense through your lumbar spine, your low back, or maybe around the back of your legs. That may mean the hamstrings are again a little bit tighter. It could also be caused by that limited range of mobility in the shoulder, but it's feeling in the legs or the hips. If you're feeling that sensation, again, low back or in the legs, sometimes it's like the first downward facing dog of your practice, but by the end you're warmed up. So this can be an easy modification. You bend your knees more deeply. So when the hands are on the ground, your hips are up and back, feet are separated whatever distance you're working with, you're gonna bend your knees a little bit more than they naturally move into. As you bend your knees more, you still wanna press your heart back towards the thighs, making that peak or angle shape, not a plank position, so we're not in this kind of like funky crawling space, keeping the arms moving towards the ears. So you're pressing the heart back towards the feet. Now when you do that, your heels may lift a little bit. That's absolutely welcome and normal. It should take some of the pull away from the back of the leg and release some of that tension across your low back, because you're going to be in a deeper hip flexor or hip flexion space. And in this position, you still get that long length, building great stability in the shoulders, but taking tension away from your low back and through the body. And again, over time, you may find that the legs can straighten more, whether it's in one class or over months or years. You may find just a little bit more length, but it's a really quick, easy adjustment rather than rounding through your spine. And again, if you're not sure if you're doing that, maybe the sensation is kind of subtle. Take a picture of yourself, see what your body shape looks like, and be, oh, my low back is rounding. I should maybe try bending my knees and see if that gives me a little bit of release or a little bit more space for my neck and my shoulders. So easy, quick adjustment, try bending your knees, but again, keep pressing your heart back. Another adjustment based again on sensation. If you're feeling that you kind of just don't bend much at the hips, again, this can be caused for several reasons. We're not working on diagnostics, but if you were to do a forward fold, just standing on feet any distance, doesn't really matter to play with it. If you find that your hands don't come to blocks easily, or maybe you stay more in that 90-degree angle or higher, you have a limited hip flexion, that bend at the hips. If it doesn't go there, you may want to, again, play with a different adjustment of props. You can do downward facing dog on blocks. And what that does is it just lengthens the distance of the arm and the torso in comparison to the ratio of the leg. So it's going to require less hip flexion. If you're using the blocks underneath the hands, a couple of suggestions. I suggest one of the lower heights, obviously not the super tall high height, it's very unstable, it's going to tip. The middle height doesn't have quite as much surface area for the hand to go on, which is not wrong, it's not bad, it's absolutely fine if that's the height you need it. Your hand will kind of wrap over the edges. If you bring it down to the lowest height, you can mimic more like the floor and have your hands more fully on, which gives you work of padabandha or hastabandha, or hand lock to bring your hands onto the block. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So if you can go lower, take those blocks lowest height. If it doesn't go that high, that's totally fine. Go up a middle height, that's fine too. Something firm and stable. If you're using a block, usually wood blocks are the slipperiest. Cork blocks is going to absorb some of that sweat if your hands are sweaty. Foam blocks may put a little bit more pressure on your wrist. If you're using kind of those cheapo foam blocks that you get from, you know, big box stores, the Manduka ones and some of the other more specific yoga brands are a denser foam, so they usually feel better on your wrists. That's why I like those sorts of props. But again, any prop that you're using, just make sure that it feels stable. It's not too squishy underneath your wrist, and it's not too slippery. You're not going to slide off of it. When you put your hand on the block, put your whole hand on. So you don't want to put the hand at the edge or end of either side of the block, because when you start to go up, they can tip or tilt in either direction. You can slide off of it, but again, it's going to put more pressure onto the wrist itself. So again, the whole hand on. So if you're using the blocks underneath your hands, again, the hands will go onto the blocks as much of the hand as you can reach onto the block. If it's higher up, that's okay, but just make sure as much of the hand as you can reach so you can really push down through the fingers. And it's the same idea, downward facing dog, lifting the hips up and back. You can adjust this, bend your knees if that gives you more space, let your heels lift, that's absolutely welcome. But your intention, again, making that peak shape through the body, that triangle or mountain. So the hips go up and back, maybe relax the head and neck. That can also be a nice adjustment if you have larger breast tissue. Downward facing dog is an inversion. We don't think of it, but your head, your heart are below the line of the hips. Your hips are higher, your heart is higher than your head all of a sudden. So it is bringing the body, the torso, upside down. That being said, breast tissue when we fall towards the throat, sometimes it feels like it's suffocating or it's just in your face and it's annoying. Elevate, put blocks underneath your hands, and it's going to give you maybe a couple of more inches of space, a little bit more ease to breathe and work on that pranayama, that breath control. So again, blocks, really easy adjustment underneath your hands to either give space for the hips, the low back, the hamstrings, or for the chest and the breath. So again, add them if you want them. Now, if you're using the blocks underneath your hands in downward facing dog, if you're in a more of a flow-based practice, on all levels, flow, an intermediate flow, whatever it is, if you're in a more of a flow-based practice, sometimes the blocks may get in the way. We say step between your hands. It's no big deal. You can step other ways. So your foot doesn't have to come directly between your hands. Maybe you step your foot to the outside first, and then you have room to squiggle it onto center. That can be a really nice way to practice. And then again, coming back out, you do the same thing. Take the foot to the outside of the blocks first, and then go back. So again, adjust, make room, modify, make your practice your own. Another option, based again on sensation. If you find that there's discomfort in the wrists in downward facing dog, this is very, very common. If there's discomfort in the wrists, there could be a million reasons why. Based on the shape, maybe your shoulders are really far forward and the shoulder mobility is just not right there. And you're putting a lot more weight on the hand. Maybe it's an injury, carpal tunnel syndrome. It could be a multitude of things. But there are some really easy ways to adjust or focus your downward facing dog. First focus will be more engagement of your hand. So in downward facing dog, the whole hand is on the ground, the fingers are spread open wide. It is known as hastabandha or hand lock. It's an energetic lock, an activation through the muscles, the energy of the hand, and a connection of the hand to the ground. In that hand lock, a couple of details that will be helpful here. First and foremost, make sure your thumb, the whole base of your thumb stays down. Sometimes we see the thumb start to peek up. Do it for a hot second, no big deal. When we put a lot of body weight, a lot of pressure for a longer period of time, or when we're moving, like stepping forward, stepping back, and the thumb is lifted, you put the thumb at risk. It can just kind of buckle or tilt weirdly, and then we can cause tweak or injury. The joint is called a saddle joint. It's one of those joints that's kind of more finicky, a little bit harder to heal. So I suggest keep that thumb down. Don't put too much pressure, especially on that little joint in the top of the thumb just underneath your nail. It puts a lot of pressure on that joint, so let's keep that whole thumb down. Next step or focus. When your hand is on the ground, again, fingers are spread open wide. There's an energetic trying to squeeze of your fingers in towards each other. Now, they're not actually going to touch because your hand is on the ground, but you're trying to squeeze your fingers towards each other. When you do that, and I'll try and turn my hand so you can see kind of a different angle. When you start to squeeze in, you may notice there's like a little pocket at the center of the palm that starts to lift up. When you start to squeeze in towards each other, and again, they're not necessarily touching, but squeezing in energetically, it's active. It's a lot of work in the hand. But it starts to lift the base of the palm, which is going to help to lift the base of the wrist, the carpal tunnel. We want to keep that tunnel open or lifted so that it doesn't feel compressive or uncomfortable. So again, squeeze the fingers in towards each other. Now, what's actually touching the ground? You're going to have every finger onto the ground, including the thumb. You're also going to have the base or the top of the palm of the hand, the space underneath your fingers, onto the ground as well. So you want to make sure that space is touching underneath the fingers. At the outside, the edge of the hand, and then again at the base of the thumb. All those spaces are touching the ground and you're energetically squeezing in. There is a cue you'll hear pretty often in a yoga practice. Press more through your index finger and your thumb, that L shape of your hand. Push more through that space. It can, for some people or sometimes, be really, really helpful. Especially if you tend to put a lot of pressure on the outside of your wrist, it's going to push a little bit more energy to the inside and just kind of balance out. For some people or some days, it doesn't feel good. So if it doesn't feel good, don't do it. Don't worry about it. But you're trying to keep those fingers down. You just don't want to lift the index finger and thumb. Keep those rooted down. So again, if you're feeling a lot of pressure in the wrist or the hand when you're in downward facing dog, again, first step, try that hasta bandha. Try squeezing the fingers in towards each other and pushing down through that whole hand. The next step, or again, if it's a different injury or condition, that this is not going to help it. It's not going to fix it. You tried it, or you know it's not the answer. The next step is to use, again, additional props or to modify the posture. A nice prop that we have in the studio, or again, you can get really easily online if you were to buy, is a foam wedge. Yoga wedge, if you put it into Google, you should pop up with some answers. This foam wedge takes some of the angle out of the wrist. So instead of being more in a flexion, you're going to be a little bit more at an angle. When you put your hand onto the foam wedge, you don't want your hand over the thick edge of the wedge, because again, that's going to create more of the extension through the wrist. It's going to put too much pressure onto the wrist. Instead, you're going to walk your hand down and use as much of the wedge as you want. So you could have almost your whole hand onto the wedge if you need a little bit more of space. If the more angle feels worse, use less of an angle at the wrist. Or you can use just a tiny little bit of the wedge. Maybe you just need a tiny little bit of elevation. You don't want too much, just a little bit more lift. Go ahead and use less of the wedge. I'll demo that on top of my yoga mat for a second, just so you can see what that space would be like. Again, still spreading the fingers open, make sure the thumb stays down as you go up and back. Now, one thing I will tell you, especially if you get the foam version, is they're slippery. You'll slide right off of them. So I really do encourage you, if you're going to use this in the studio for something like downward facing dog, we use them for other poses too, but for downward facing dog, put it underneath your yoga mat. So the skinny end faces forward, the thick end is facing towards you, and then you have that elevation, but you have the grip of your yoga mat, and you can go into downward facing dog. Now in that, again, just like the blocks, sometimes it's going to be in a different position for stepping forward. So instead of putting my foot between my hands, I may step it before my hand, and then I can adjust my back foot to get into the pose that I want to be in. So just know that you may have to adjust where you step or stand. Often I'll see people using the purple wedge underneath the hands during a practice and they're constantly taking it out and putting it in, taking it out, putting it in, that's fine, no big deal. It's your practice. You do what you want to do. But if it's annoying you, just think about stepping your front foot before your hand and put your back foot where you want to put it. So you may do it a little extra squiggling, but if that means it's more easeful for your mind, you don't have to adjust, where is my prop? Oh, I have to take it out and put it back in before I can go into my flow. Go ahead and adjust that. Also, you can use these 4 things like plank, chaturanga, dandasana, your flows or anything else. But again, minimal wedge, try it, see how much you need. But I would suggest working on that hasta bandha because it strengthens the hand and the wrist over time. So this is there if you need it, or if you want it, go ahead and Google it. You can find those for yourself. The last little adjustment for your downward facing dog, based on sensation. If you find that your calves, the back of the lower part of the leg, is stretching a lot when you do downward facing dog, or if not a sensation, you just find that your heels don't touch the ground, that's okay, that's normal. They never have to touch the ground. That's based usually on bone structure, but also again the length of the muscles. But if you want more support, it feels more comfortable to have your heels touching the ground, or again, if the calves feel like they're stretching a lot and it's really uncomfortable, put something underneath your heels. Just like the wedge, just like you'd put it underneath your wrist, you're gonna put something underneath your heels. So in that downward facing dog, I've got a blanket folded up at the back of my mat. I'm gonna be in downward facing dog, and I can walk my downward facing dog back until my heels come down onto the blanket. Now, it's not your whole foot. You're not trying to elevate your foot higher. Putting it just underneath your heel and maybe some of the sole of your foot. So maybe fill in some of the arch of your foot. It gives, again, a little bit more lift for the heels. May feel better in the hamstrings, the calves, so that you're not stretching a lot into the back of the leg. But it also is less of an angle. So instead of a very deep extension or dorsiflexion through the ankle, it's going to give a little bit more space. For a lot of people, that's going to be more comfortable. Now, if you're in downward facing dog, you're coming in and out pretty quickly, you may not necessarily want it, and that's totally fine. If you're working on holding or sustaining downward facing dog, or for that fact, dolphin pose or something else, and you want that support, again, you just tuck it at the back of your mat, and you can go on with your whole practice, stepping in and out, and it's there when you want it. Can be a really nice option. And again, your heels never have to touch the ground. If they don't, that's okay. It's a misconception that in time they may touch the ground, they may never. It doesn't matter, no big deal. It's just, again, this kind of old school thought that every body can get to that space, where based on bone structure, how it's grown in your body over years or decades, it might not, and that's fine. So again, easy props and adjustments, play with those. The last little detail or focus, more so based on the shape of your body or the position itself. Maybe not based on sensation. So you may not feel your downward facing dog feels uncomfortable. It may feel fine. But again, I encourage you, play with it, see what it looks like, take a picture, film yourself, ask a friend to give you some feedback, see what it feels like or play with it in your downward facing dog, especially for those of you who are super mobile in your shoulders. So we talked a lot about people who need maybe some more support for less mobility of the hips, the hamstrings, etc., etc. For those of you who are very mobile in the shoulders, you can bring your arm pretty far back behind your ears or head without sticking your head forward. If you have that extra range of mobility for the shoulders, the chest, your back bends are deeper, I'm going to encourage you to not go too far in that press of the heart back towards the feet. We use the cue often, press your heart back towards the feet, make that peak, that triangle shape in your body, because that's the shape of the pose. And we want to encourage it to be less like a plank and more into that triangle or downward facing dog. If you are super mobile though, if you have a lot of space in your downward facing dog, you may find that you overpress. You can press so far back that you start to create more of a back bend through the spine or almost a pinching in the shoulders. If you find that you're one of those mobile people, I'm going to encourage you to come out just a little bit. And when you come out, it's not necessarily just don't go as far, but engage more. Engage more stability through the center of the body, the core, and engage more a little bit through the shoulders. So you're going to take the shoulders away from the ears. So 2 steps. First step is going to be through the center body of the core, just like dead bugs. So if we're in our back bend, our extension like cow pose, we're going to think ribs down to the hips with an exhale, and it's going to come out a little bit. That alone is going to bring you maybe a little bit further forward. The second step, which is more subtle, and I'll turn towards the camera for this one. The second step is when the arms are overhead, letting there be more space between the ear and the bicep or the arm itself. So thinking shoulders down the back or even a little bit wider. So in that, if we're in the exaggerated downward facing dog, I'm over pressing, I'm going to engage my core and I'm going to pull my shoulders away from the ears, get a little bit more space between the earlobe and the shoulder or the arm and the ear. So when you're in downward facing dog, if you're overextended, first engage the core, exhale, and then shoulders away from the ears. So you find again from overextension to more of a neutral space. Not so far that you're pulling forward of the arms into a plank, not so far in the core that you're rounding the low back. And that's again where working with a teacher, a peer, a friend or family member in the same room as you, filming yourself or taking pictures can kind of just give you a little bit more feedback of where's that space. But especially if you are working with kind of those more external factors, a person or a camera, do still pay attention to sensation. If the video looks really, really good, you're like, oh, I'm a perfect triangle, cool, but it feels like crap, not worth it. So pay attention to those sensations as well. So I hope this is all very helpful to you. There are, of course, many other adjustments for downward facing dog, but depending on a specific person. So if you do have questions, we can always work on it in a class, whether it's virtual or in person. But I hope you play with some of these ideas, even if you just play with them once, to kind of understand how the body composes a position and how that may change the energy of a pose, make it more easeful, more challenging, more focused. Play with them, see what it does. Have a great time. I'll see you soon.